Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to Charting a Pathway from Insights to Action. This is a multifaceted endeavor. We got some of the ideas from this session first started with the SciPEP prospectus, which provides a framework for taking action. It was our ideas, Brooke, and I, to champion quality evidence, to catalyze conversations among people, and to connect people in institutions for talking about communicating basic science. But in this prospectus, we framed really large questions that we have because we have way more questions than answers. And we wanted to know, what should we do with those questions? How do we get them answered? Where do we start? Are they even the right questions? So the Kavli Foundation commissioned a qualitative study to ask science communication scholars and practitioners, how would you answer these questions? And this morning, we're going to hear from Rose Hendricks, who with a colleague ran a qualitative study to dig in to how do we answer these questions? And they have a fantastic set of people that they got their thoughts and responses from. So please join me, Rose, and we will hear from her and about the findings of her report.
Thank you, Keegan. It looks like my screen is now being shared. Is that correct? Yes. Good morning or afternoon, and thanks for joining this session. And of course, thanks to the organizers for the invitation to share today. My name is Rose Hendricks. I'm a senior advisor for research at the Association of Science and Technology Centers. And I'm sharing today some research that I conducted with my colleague, Marissa Fond. As Keegan mentioned, we set out to really understand the science communication and engagement community's perspectives on priorities for basic science communication and engagement. So our starting point here is this clip from the prospectus. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, and it pointed out that when it comes to basic science communication and engagement, there are actually many more questions than answers. And these are questions like, what does successful communication about basic science topics look like? Or to what extent is basic science communication or engagement already taking place? And what needs to happen for it to be more effective? So given that there really aren't many published insights on questions like these, the prospectus noted the need for a comprehensive research agenda to improve and advance practices and training for public engagement in basic science. So our task was to take one step toward that agenda by speaking to people with different perspectives and expertise related to basic science, communication, and engagement. Here's how we did it. We asked a number of members of the communication and engagement community, of the many questions articulated in the prospectus, which should be prioritized, or in other words, which are essential to know or to know first, or which seem like they'll provide insights that will help us understand other questions. And then beyond learning what questions should be prioritized, we wanted to know how the fields can pursue them, what kinds of activities, whether research or otherwise, could help advance our collective understanding. And so we spoke with 30 people. They were a combination of practitioners, researchers, and basic scientists. And of course, many people identify as more than one of these things. And it had semi-structured interviews, meaning that we had a list of questions we did want to ask, but we were able to be flexible and go where our interviewees had interest and expertise. So it was not completely rigid. Basically, though, we asked for a number of the questions included in the prospectus. What do you feel is already known on this? What is not known? And how can we go about addressing those unknowns? We synthesized everybody's responses to arrive at a set of 6 broad questions that there was the most energy around, and then a few approaches that different stakeholders across the field could take to address those questions. I'm going to share the 6 broad questions in a moment, but first, a few overarching themes. The first is that there were many common questions in the sense that they were common to the prospectus and also similar across participants. For example, a lot of our participants were interested in the question of how or whether members of the public think about basic science, how we can best train basic science communicators, and what outcomes are possible and common from basic science communication or engagement. Another theme we heard a lot about was a need for detailed and context-specific approaches. So when we asked what kind of information would be most valuable to start getting answers, we repeatedly heard that we really need to kind of get pretty fine-grained here. It's challenging to know what to do with broad statements about, say, the public, or even about specific segments of the public, because those kinds of statements would obscure the context and nuance. So, for example, if we take that question of how members of the public think about basic science, our interviewees wanted to know about specific publics. They also wanted to know about mental models, sort of what the underlying assumptions and kind of mental frameworks were that people are using to make sense of basic science. Things like what topics they're thinking of, how they think about the purpose or the value of basic science, and of course, relevance of basic science to their lives. And then related, what are their past experiences with basic science and engagement? So in other words, our interviewees were telling us that they really want to get a holistic picture on some of these questions, as opposed to just broad statements. And this is just one example of what that looked like. Another theme is that our interviewees were unsure about whether and when basic science itself is a helpful focal point. While they were all able to provide definitions of basic science that were consistent with the one included in the prospectus, after then defining the term, many people expressed uncertainty or skepticism about the distinction between basic and applied sciences, both for research itself and also for types of communication. I think a lot of people struggled with this because they saw kind of scientific research on a continuum with the concepts of basic and applied as like theoretical poles, but then particular fields and topics and research programs occupied various gray spaces in between. And then beyond this gray area, there was a challenge that basic science communication engagement was really not very salient for many interviewees. So even when we explicitly asked about basic science topics, interviewees frequently defaulted to talking about all science or provided examples of applied communication or engagement, like health recommendations related to COVID-19. So we think this is really an invitation to interrogate under which circumstances the basic versus applied distinction is most helpful. When does it yield important differences in approach? And when is another distinction or no distinction at all potentially most helpful? Another theme we heard was that basic science was generally associated with one-way communication. This was much more salient and concrete for participants than something more kind of bidirectional or multi-directional and dynamic. So a lot of people offered prototypical communication examples like media, education, or kind of events like lectures. And those who offered examples of more multi-directional engagement tended to be sharing examples of exchanges on applied science topics. And some of our participants explicitly noted that they couldn't picture what an engagement like a dialogue or deliberation or knowledge co-production would look like for basic science topics. They were unsure what those kinds of activities would be designed to accomplish or what they could actually accomplish. And other participants stated that engagement is just much more difficult for the basic sciences because it's more challenging to equip public audiences to be effective partners and to determine what they would gain from activities like collaborative research. And then some just asserted to us that for basic science topics, engagement is really not relevant. Communication is what the field should focus on. So this was quite a diverse set of responses on this. And this tells us that probably the use of the terms communication and engagement, kind of distinguishing between them and being specific about which is relevant in which contexts is particularly pertinent for basic sciences, and one that we might be mindful of as we address the priority questions in the coming years. And then the final theme before I dive in is when we asked what should the field do to address the things that are not known, this was a really challenging question for most interviewees. And I think all the themes I've already mentioned probably play a role in making this a challenging question. In addition, we recognize that, especially for people who often think at sort of the individual or institutional level, sort of all day long, zooming out to the field level itself is a challenge. But nevertheless, a number of participants did have some ideas for how the questions they saw as most important could be addressed. And then as social scientists, we supplemented participants' suggestions with our own insights to arrive at a set of suggested priority questions and approaches to advance the field's understanding of effective and equitable basic science communication and engagement. One thing I'll just note, of course, is that these are starting points. All of the questions that the interviewees surfaced and prioritized can be approached from many angles through many methods. So this is just a sample of possibilities that we hope will kind of spark some ideas. Okay, so diving into the questions then, the first priority question we heard about was, what are the values that guide basic science communication and engagement? In other words, why are so many people sharing basic science? There was a clear assumption that communication and engagement on basic topics are valuable, but how they were valuable was less clear. And we heard a kind of a wide range of potential reasons, some of which were kind of conflicted with each other from one person to the next. And it wasn't clear how conscious these values were. It was significant to us, though, that we heard such different perspectives on values, because ideally values should really serve as the principles that guide a field's actions. So how could this be addressed? This is not really an empirical question, though maybe it could have some empirical inputs, but largely field-wide discussion on this, whether it's through publications or conference presentations or convenings, can all help surface values and their alignment or tension or open questions. The next priority question is what do we know about audience perspectives on basic science topics? So this is one I kind of shared earlier, but some of the specific things our interviewees wanted to know were things like, what do various audiences know or believe about the scientific process? Things like how science is funded, how long research takes, how the process requires iteration and uncertainty and self-correction. Or what do different audiences know and think about how salient basic science is? Probably not too surprising that applied topics tend to be top of mind in polling research, but how far under the surface is basic science? And then what do audiences know or believe about particular scientific topics, recognizing that, of course, basic science itself is a concept with many diverse ideas within it. And so a lot of attendees wanted to get down to the field or topic level. The third question we heard was a priority is the role of training in catalyzing effective and equitable basic science communication and engagement. It was assumed that training is generally good, though interviewees stress that because of a lack of systematic or comprehensive evaluation, we don't really know in what ways it's good or for whom, under what circumstances, including the extent to which it serves basic science communicators' needs. So what we need here is really something I think many of us know we need more of, which is evaluation. This might mean adding a basic science lens to evaluations that are already taking place, or perhaps undertaking additional ones to really zoom in on the effects of training for basic scientists or communicators. The next priority question we heard was what goals do communicators have for sharing basic science with public audiences? And then what goals are strategic? So what do individuals and institutions currently aim to achieve? What strategic goals should maybe they aim to achieve? And then what forms of field-wide support could enable more communicators to set strategic goals for basic science communication and engagement? Fifth is how should various basic science topics be framed in different contexts to achieve particular goals? So while some participants discussed the framing challenge as a utility versus curiosity question, others saw these two frames as compatible and complementary, and other people felt like there are additional valuable frames to consider, such as sort of focusing on a relatable researcher story or emphasizing connections to other areas of knowledge or lived experience. And now this sort of sounds like one question, but really it's kind of a conglomeration of many questions, including a kind of nearly infinite number of topics and audiences and goals and other factors, all of which might affect the way that a basic science topic should be framed. So we heard a number of different ways to explore this from the researchers we spoke to, and this tells us that probably a combination of qualitative and quantitative approaches would be well suited to addressing it. And then the final question I'll share is what outcomes are possible and common, and what can the field learn about evaluation practices that are meaningful and realistic? So our interviewees really stress that the field does not have a systematic understanding of engagement outcomes for public audiences or for the communicators in their institutions as well. And so there was interest in understanding the range of potential outcomes, what factors are most important for giving rise to various outcomes, and then what evaluation tools or practices yield the most valuable insights for communicators, given their generally limited time and resources for undertaking evaluation. So I will just end with this kind of statement that, yes, there are certainly many questions, and these interviews reinforce that. But I think the good news here is that there are actually many opportunities and many entry points to contribute to a collective understanding here. So with that, I'll stop and pass it off to the other speakers and look forward to discussion and to your questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rose. So that report has given us a lot to think about. So I'm going to invite Rose and Reyhaneh Maktoufi, Xinnan, and Ashley Cate to join me here as we discuss some of the things that are in this report and ideas. And as noted in the chat briefly, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section so that I can be sure to see them. You can put questions there and you can upvote questions. That'll help me prioritize. I would greatly appreciate that. So first, I want to have our panelists introduce themselves. Just say your name, where you're coming from, and how what you do relates to action. Why don't we begin with Ashley?
Great. Thank you so much, Keegan. Thank you for having me. My name is Ashley Cate. I am a graduate student in the Department of Life Sciences Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And as such, I am involved in science communication research.
Great. And Xinnan?
Hi, welcome, and glad to meet everyone virtually. My name is Xinnan, and I am with the Kavli Institute for Particle Astrophysics and Cosmology at Stanford. I'm the Outreach and Engagement Manager here, basically acting as a bridge between the external evaluators and also our scientists to provide a better to train our scientists.
Wonderful. And Reyhaneh?
Hi all, my name is Reyhaneh Maktoufi. I'm a Science Communication and Outreach Fellow at HHMI Tangled Bank Studios. We make science documentaries, but we also make impact campaigns. So meaning that any documentary that we have has a goal, and to support that goal, we work with libraries, communities, museums to have a lot of different activities to support the goals of those documentaries. And the way I think a lot of our work is action-oriented is that we do research, we also do production, we also work with communities. And each of these not only inform each other, but kind of informs like the next research we want to do, the next work we want to do, the next documentary we want to make, and they all kind of tap into each other.
Wonderful. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. And the reason we invited these excellent people with us today is because they all represent different frames of taking action in terms of doing more research, in terms of developing programs, resources, and evaluation that help their scientists, and in terms of communicating about basic science or other areas of science. So thank you for joining us. So what I want to ask, reactions to this, what surprises you the most or least about these sort of questions and recommendations, and why? Or which of these seem the most useful for advancing, communicating about basic science, or advancing our conversation that we're having today? Does anybody want to jump in and start first?
Okay, I can start. I thought there's a thread between all of, also Rose, wonderful stuff. Thank you for doing this. Something that I really appreciated seeing is that I know we all talk a lot about strategic science communication, the fact that like you have certain tactics in order to have certain small objectives that like, hey, I want this film to get people to experience awe, and you want a final goal that after they experience awe, I really want them to go out and like plant a new tree. And this strategic thinking shows in all the questions that were brought up. And I think while they're separate, they're all connected. So it's the values that kind of help you think of what your goal is. And then when you have your goal, right, then you have all these conversations around, are we actually doing strategic communication? I think something that is like really lacking in a lot of the organizations that do science communication is this idea of like, before we make anything, before we do anything that we have done for years, can we just sit and figure out what is it that we want our audience to do, right? Can we decide on that? Can we connect our values to that decision that we're making about what our audience is going to do? And one of the reasons that a lot of times this doesn't happen is because the training of strategic communication hasn't happened. We don't think a lot of times in strategic communication ways, and that includes me. Like a lot of times I get excited and I'm like, oh, this would make for great content. We should make that. And I think of the idea and everything. And at the end of it, I'm like, did I think about what I want out of my audience, or did I just think this is very cool and I just really want to do it? And then all of that is like, okay, now that in order for me to figure out if this is all working, I have to think of that final goal to connect it with my evaluation. And once we haven't figured that out, then the evaluation is going to be like all up in the air, kind of being like, am I looking at the views? What am I looking at, right? So I appreciated that everything that comes up kind of has actually like a connection with strategic communication. And I feel like once we figure that part out, a lot of things fall into place.
Great, thank you. Ashley, do you have some thoughts? What sort of surprised you or resonated you out of this report
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, I want to echo what Reyhaneh said. Rose, this report was really enlightening, and I really enjoyed reading it, and I'm really glad that you went ahead and did this work. It's very helpful, I think, in moving forward basic science communication. I think maybe one of the things that didn't surprise me that came from this report is also probably the reason that you did this report was this idea of really needing more granular assessment of, specific community level and context specific approaches. Like, I think that's, you did a qualitative research project to come up with the idea that we need more qualitative research. So yeah, that was one of the outcomes that I think made a lot of sense to me. Something that I was kind of surprised by, but maybe shouldn't have been so surprised by, was a lot of these individuals that you interviewed talked about how they feel that basic science or basic science communication doesn't really lend itself well to this two-directional engagement, that it's really better suited for this unidirectional or very communication focused, I guess communication focused communication. So I think that that's a really interesting perspective that, like I said, I hadn't really thought about, and I'm wondering, where that's coming from. If that is, there was a couple of other concerns that came up in these interviews about whether or not there should be such a hard distinction between basic and applied, which is definitely something. Oh, I think my camera's cutting out. Anyway, definitely something that has come up in basic science communication discussions before. Another thing that I was wondering is if maybe it's is being contributed to by these, like what Reyhaneh was talking about, this idea that we don't always have our goals and objectives figured out before we go into a communication endeavor. Or an engagement endeavor, and maybe that's where some of that is coming from. But I don't know if you guys have other thoughts as well, but that was one of the things that kind of surprised me a little bit, and I was trying to grapple with it a little bit, like why do we have this perception that basic science communication is better suited for being very one-directional and educational as opposed to being very engaging or two-directional?
Great. And Xinnan, I want to bring you into this conversation too. What are some things that might have surprised you about the recommendations in this report?
Well, so that's a great question. Well, first, I wanted to circle the back since I let's just say. When I joined about assessment and about goal setting, and this is actually what we're trying to do right now at SciPEP, is actually trying to figure out and interview by scientists, asking their goals are when they're doing public. Of us know that we're going to actually perform this kind of without any goals. It's
hey, what am I supposed to do? Maybe just sharing my research, right? And
that's very
to one direction instead of having this goal in mind and designing everything.
So I'm,
and of course, we were able to consolidate it into
some of the more common goals.
So
some other institutional goals, including
to become better science communicators.
So I would say probably with me more than surprising me. And I'm just really glad that at least what we
on with the lines with the recommendations.
Keegan, can we respond to each other or like build off of each other's, or do you want to?
Absolutely. I would love for you to build off of each other's. And then I'm going to have, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A specifically for Rose about how people responded to your questions. So we will bring those in next. So go ahead, Ray. What were your thoughts?
So Ashley brought up something that I've been thinking a lot. It's that idea that like Rose was talking about, like the there's a spectrum, right? It's applied and basic. And I've been struggling with this idea of like, is it helpful for us to have so many dichotomies, right? We have like this idea of Western science, which I absolutely hate because it's not Western, and we have traditional science, and those are not actually two separate things. They're a spectrum. Same thing with applied science and like, you know, basic science. Are these dichotomies harmful or helpful? Do we want to keep them? Do we want to think about not using them or reframing them? Or maybe not. Maybe it is important. I'm just very curious to hear people's thoughts on like, should we rethink the whole terminology and how we think of these words?
And that was a big part of our discussions yesterday. Any thoughts, Ashley?
I was going to say the same thing, Keegan. I was just about to respond that, you know, I got to attend a few of the sessions yesterday, and that came up in every single one that I attended anyway was this idea that we don't know, right? Like, I think we just don't know if this distinction is harmful or helpful. I do know that in some of the research that I've been involved in, a lot of scientists sort of classify themselves as at least a little of both, sometimes a lot of both. Very few really consider themselves very strictly applied or very strictly basic, although they do exist. And I think something that came up a lot yesterday too was like, even if we do draw these very hard distinctions, are there a lot of differences in how they should be communicating and engaging? And I think what that might come down to is more so the audience. And I think that the audience really is probably, I mean, my personal perception is that the audience it needs to be very heavily considered when it comes to how communication and engagement is done, probably definitely regardless of whether it's basic or applied. And then I don't know if it will matter for basic versus applied on using the same audience. Or attending the same audience.
Right. And there's an interesting question, somewhat related in the Q&A, where a lot of this dichotomy of basic versus applied is driven by the way that we apply for research funding, right? There are institutions that fund basic research, and there are institutions that fund more applied types of research. And at least in my context with working with the federal government, it's really our responsibility of taxpayer dollars to make sure we're communicating about how that research is being funded and what's coming the result of it. So that's where one place where the dichotomy might matter in communications. I'm curious, Rose, because this has come up and also in the Q&A, if some of the participants you interviewed, you know, what did they, were these the type of people that thought about strategic communications you thought more in general? So I'm riffing here a little bit off of Ashley saying one thing that surprised her is people talked about it as one-way communication. Were they the type of people who also think about strategic communications and choosing whether something is an engagement two-way model versus one-way, and had any thinking about this value in using basic science as a frame?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, so we were really deliberate when we developed our list of interviewees to pick people who had, whether because of their position or the work they've done, like some evidence that they were sort of like meta thinkers about the field. And so that they were, in many cases, practitioners or researchers, and also engaged in some of these strategic questions. And so I do think that is true. And so perhaps our interviewees are also in some ways not reflective of the entire field. As for their kind of connection to basic and applied sciences, we were able to find, it was hard to find practitioners and researchers who focused exclusively or even largely on basic science, which is probably not surprising given what has already been unearthed in the prospectus and the previous conference. Though we had many interviewees who were kind of like worked across all fields of science with sort of different levels of connections to basic and applied science. And while we asked people a little bit about their own background, whether it was in doing basic or applied science, in training researchers who identify with basic or applied, in communicating different topics, we didn't actually intentionally kind of connect whether people were more likely to say that they, saw basic science as only relevant to one-way communication based on their background. Our sample size of 30 is a bit too small for that kind of conclusion. So I do think that would be an interesting thing to look at in the future, is whether those who have kind of different kinds of backgrounds or expertise tend to lean more towards the communication side. But I will say that when people talked about really kind of like a multi-directional exchange, collaborative type of encounter, with respect to basic science, it was almost always in the abstract. And again, a lot of participants pointed out to us that, like, I actually can't think of a specific example, or I can't tell you what this really would look like in practice, but I'm just sort of imagining something like this. And so it was definitely a hard concept for people to pin down or to kind of think back of things they had experienced in the past.
So I'm curious from our panelists then, knowing that this is difficult to grapple with, and yet there's still people who need or want to communicate about basic science, or basic scientists who want or need to communicate about the work that they're doing. Where would you get started? Like, if you had resources, where would you direct them towards in terms of actions now versus, maybe in a couple of years when we get some questions answered? Thoughts? Who would like to jump in?
Well, I can quickly jump in.
All right, Xinnan.
Oh, yeah. So what I found really helpful is, with the support from the Kavli Foundation, we actually got to hire a team of evaluators and also get to work with for evaluation that really map out and these goals. With these evaluators, we're actually able to identify, for example, buildings scientists as trustworthy individuals, and also caring for the audience's needs. Those are some of the examples goals, and it was actually very helpful when we're working with the evaluators and researchers to identify specific ways, very specific and minor sometimes tactics to help us better reach these goals. How do we actually demonstrate that we are actually caring about our audience's needs and preferences, instead of just like, oh, I am here to talk to you about my research. I don't really care what you think of it. Right. So I think that was something that I thought was really helpful, and definitely having someone who is doing scicomm research on the team, that just opened up my mind. So I'll just leave it there.
Great, thank you. Thoughts, Ashley? Where would you start?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think Xinnan brings up a couple of really good points on how practitioners can move forward with these recommendations. I think also there's a lot of opportunity for basic scientists and for audiences to move forward in basic science communication. And I think one of the things that I would probably want to invest a lot more of my time in, I think, is identifying, what the specific audiences are, who are we trying to communicate and engage with? How are we segmenting them in meaningful ways also? Whether that be, education, interest in science, interest in specific scientific topics, many other socio and economics, demographics and variables, and really understanding what they want to get out of the engagement and the communication efforts. And I think something that might come with this is a lot of relationship building, which is very time intensive, but will become, if we really want to dig into more qualitative research, it will become very valuable. There's community partners out there that have created trusting relationships with communities that, if you can create a trusting relationship with community partners, like I said, it is time intensive. You have a far better shot at reaching whatever communities you intend to reach. And I think that is something that will be really important for basic science communication, is understanding the audience a lot better. And I think it might also help developing goals. Once you understand what the audience wants to get out of it, it can really help you also understand where your goals and objectives and hopeful outcomes should be.
Excellent. And we have just a couple minutes left, and I want to make sure Ray has an opportunity.
Yeah, I'm going to try to make this very quick. I would say funding experimental spaces where people have the freedom to really try different things and be okay with failing, where you can bring in people that want to do communication, people that know how to strategize, people that could evaluate. And I'm saying this because I collected my PhD dissertation work at the Adler Planetarium. They had a space called the Space Visualization Lab, where they had astronomy conversations. And that means different scientists, a lot of them grad students, would just come in. There would be a lot of cool visualizations, and they could talk about whatever they wanted with the public. And like they said, okay, the name of this space is astronomy conversation. Like this is what's going to happen. It's about conversation. So you can do anything if that conversation happens. And my goal is not for anyone to learn anything. I just want them to come out, feel like, oh, this is really cool. I want to come back here again, right? The person that was doing a lot of this work was very experimental. He gave a lot of us a lot of freedom. He let me do all kind of research. I could bring my research back to a lot of the speakers. I could just give talks myself and feel like how it is for a person to try to talk about basic science. And it was really something that made all of us very happy and excited, made all of us feel okay with making changes and continue having that dynamic sense. So just fund experimental spaces and give people freedom.
Good thought. And Rose, I want to come back to you. Where would you start?
I should have been prepared for that. I think I would really start by digging into some of those values and goals questions. So there were a few questions about kind of what exactly was meant by the values. And it's things like, one of my favorites is how some people told us taxpayers should know what's going on with basic science research because they've supported the work and the field is a responsibility. And then other people explicitly told us, I hear this thing about taxpayers should have a right to know about the work, and I don't agree with that. And so I would really love to start digging into things like that, probably through some interviews with members of the public to really understand the landscape there.
Great. And with that, we're going to close our session. There are a lot of really interesting questions in the Q&A we could not get to. However, I know a lot of them are relevant to the next coming sessions. So I do hope all of those people who submitted them continue to submit them in the next sessions that will specifically dig in to things they raised. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for this panel. You are excellent. And we'll see you in a few minutes at our next session.